In the second week of May 1943, the North Atlantic carried a silence that German submariners had never known. The water moved as it always had, cold and indifferent beneath the spring fog, but something in the rhythm of the war had changed. U-boat commanders who had hunted these shipping lanes for 3 years now found themselves listening more than searching. Their hydrophones turned not toward distant merchant convoys, but toward the empty sky above. The hunters had become uncertain. Within 7 days, 41 U-boats would receive the order to withdraw from the North Atlantic. They would leave not because they had been defeated in battle, but because the ocean itself had become transparent to their enemies, and the boats that had once moved through it like shadows had become visible, predictable, and alone. The transformation did not announce itself with a single battle or a decisive engagement. It accumulated across a week of small, methodical encounters in which German crews discovered that technologies they had trusted no longer protected them, that tactics refined over years of combat no longer worked, and that the industrial capacity they faced had reached a scale they could no longer comprehend or survive. The realization came not as shock, but as a slow, creeping certainty noted in patrol logs and radio transmissions, in the declining number of boats that reported their positions each evening, and in the silence that followed distress signals sent from coordinates where submarines had vanished beneath coordinated attacks they never saw coming. To understand what happened in that week, one must first understand what the U-boat war had been until that moment. Since 1940, German submarines had operated across the Atlantic with a technological and tactical confidence built on systematic advantage. They hunted at night on the surface, where their low profiles made them nearly invisible, and their diesel engines gave them speed enough to position ahead of convoys and strike from darkness. Allied merchant ships traveled in groups for mutual protection, but the protection was limited. Escort vessels in the early war years carried sonar that could detect submerged submarines, but had no reliable method for finding boats running on the surface at night. Radar existed, but the early sets carried by escort ships operated on wavelengths long enough that U-boats could detect the emissions before the escorts detected them, allowing submarines to dive and evade before being caught. This technological balance created what German naval commanders called the happy time, a period from 1940 through early 1943, when U-boats sank Allied shipping faster than it could be replaced. In 1942 alone, U-boats destroyed over 6 million tons of merchant shipping, more than 1,000 vessels sent to the bottom of the Atlantic carrying fuel, food, ammunition, and the materials needed to sustain Britain and project Allied power into Europe. The submarines achieved this through a combination of technical capability and tactical doctrine. They operated in groups called wolf packs, gathering around convoys and attacking in coordinated night surface assaults that overwhelmed escorts. The boats themselves were well designed for this work. Diesel-electric submarines capable of 14 knots on the surface and carrying enough torpedoes to make multiple attacks before returning to base. Their crews were professionals, trained in dedicated schools and selected for technical competence and psychological resilience. By early 1943, Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat arm, had over 400 operational submarines and believed that with enough boats at sea, he could sever the Atlantic supply line and force Britain out of the war. The German expectation in May 1943 was continuation, not reversal. U-boat construction had accelerated. New crews were completing training, and operational boats were being fitted with improved anti-aircraft weapons to counter the increasing threat from Allied patrol aircraft. There was concern about Allied technological development, particularly rumors of improved radar, but the fundamental tactical equation seemed stable. U-boats could still find and sink merchant ships faster than escorts could protect them, and losses among submarine crews, while increasing, remained within acceptable operational parameters. The March 1943 convoy battles had seen some of the heaviest merchant losses of the war, with 2 convoys losing 22 ships in coordinated wolf-pack attacks. German naval intelligence assessed Allied escort strength as improving, but not yet decisive. The expectation was for a long, grinding war of attrition in which German technical quality and crew experience would compensate for Allied numerical superiority. What the Germans did not fully understand was the scale and speed of Allied industrial and technological response. By May 1943, that response had matured into a system of layered capabilities that were about to converge with devastating effect. The most critical development was centimetric radar, sets operating on 10-centimeter wavelengths that U-boats could not detect and that could locate surfaced submarines in darkness or fog at ranges sufficient for coordinated attack. These radars had been installed on escort vessels and long-range patrol aircraft throughout the winter and spring of 1943. Simultaneously, the Allies had closed what was called the Atlantic Gap, the mid-ocean area beyond the range of land-based aircraft where submarines had operated with relative freedom. Very long-range B-24 Liberators, modified for maritime patrol, now covered this gap, and small escort carriers began accompanying convoys, providing air cover where none had existed before. The intelligence war had shifted as well. Allied codebreakers had achieved reliable penetration of German naval communications, allowing convoy routing officers to direct merchant groups away from known U-boat concentrations and to vector escort groups toward submarines whose positions had been disclosed through decrypted radio traffic. The Germans remained unaware of this penetration, attributing successful Allied evasion to improved direction finding or simply to bad luck. Escort tactics had evolved from simple defense to aggressive counterattack. Support groups of destroyers and corvettes now operated independently of convoys, moving to areas where U-boats had been detected and prosecuting attacks with improved sonar, forward-throwing anti-submarine mortars called hedgehogs, and depth charges set to patterns calculated from operational analysis of previous engagements. The convergence of these systems became apparent in the first week of May 1943. On May 4th, the westbound convoy ONS-5 came under attack by over 40 U-boats in the North Atlantic. The Germans expected a repeat of the March convoy battles, a series of night surface attacks that would overwhelm the escorts through sheer numbers. What occurred instead was a coordinated Allied defense that combined radar-directed surface attacks, air patrols guided by radio intelligence, and support groups vectored to the battle area from hundreds of miles away. The U-boats found themselves detected before they could position for attack, forced under by aircraft they never saw, and engaged by escort vessels that seemed to know exactly where they would surface. In 3 days of battle, the escorts sank 7 U-boats and damaged several others, while losing 13 merchant ships. The exchange rate had reversed. More submarines were being destroyed than merchant vessels, and the submarines were being sunk not through lucky encounters, but through systematic detection and prosecution. The pattern repeated across the following week. On May 6th, U-266 was caught on the surface by a Liberator aircraft equipped with centimetric radar and sunk before it could dive. On May 11th, U-528 was located by a support group using high-frequency direction-finding equipment and destroyed after a 6-hour hunt. On May 12th, U-89 was attacked by a Sunderland flying boat that detected it with radar in fog so thick the crew never saw the aircraft until the depth charges were falling. Each loss followed the same pattern:
detection before the submarine crew realized they had been found, attacks coordinated across multiple platforms, and destruction so swift that few boats had time to send detailed reports of what they had encountered.
The sound that began to define this period for U-boat crews was the radar warning receiver, a device installed on submarines to detect Allied radar emissions. In earlier months, these receivers had provided useful warning, allowing boats to dive before search radar could establish a firm contact. But in May 1943, the receivers often remained silent, even as patrol aircraft approached, because the new centimetric radars operated on frequencies the German equipment could not detect. The first indication of danger became the sound of aircraft engines overhead, or the sudden pulse of active sonar from an escort vessel that had closed to attack range undetected. Some boats reported hearing engine noise in the final moments before depth charges detonated around them, the sound of Allied machinery arriving without electronic warning, a reversal of the technical confidence that had defined U-boat operations for 3 years. By mid-May, the operational reality was clear in the statistical summaries reaching Admiral Dönitz's headquarters. In the first 20 days of the month, 31 U-boats had been lost in the North Atlantic, more than had been sunk in any previous month of the war. New boats were still entering service, but the loss rate now exceeded replacement capacity. More critically, the boats being sunk included experienced crews and commanders whose knowledge and skill could not be quickly replaced. The men graduating from training schools were adequate technicians, but lacked the combat experience that had made earlier crews effective. Meanwhile, merchant ship losses had declined sharply. The convoy system, reinforced with improved escorts and air cover, was delivering cargo across the Atlantic with acceptable losses. The strategic equation had inverted. Germany was losing the war of attrition. The final recognition came on May 24th, when Dönitz ordered all U-boats to withdraw from the North Atlantic convoy routes. The order did not admit defeat in explicit terms, framing the withdrawal as a temporary measure to allow re-equipment with improved anti-aircraft weapons and radar warning devices. But the patrol logs and after-action reports from the surviving boats told a different story. Commanders described operations in which every attempt to attack had been met with immediate counterattack, in which aircraft appeared from empty skies without warning, in which escort vessels seemed to anticipate every tactical movement. One commander felt hunted rather than hunting, a psychological shift that marked the collapse of the operational confidence U-boat crews had carried since 1940. What the Germans encountered in May 1943 was not a single weapon or a tactical innovation, but an integrated system of industrial and technological capability operating at a scale their own economy could not match. The Allies were building escort vessels faster than Germany could build submarines. They were training air crews and equipping patrol aircraft in numbers that allowed continuous coverage of convoy routes. They were producing radar sets and sonar equipment and communications systems and incorporating them into tactical doctrines refined through operational analysis and institutional learning. The U-boats faced not just better technology, but a qualitatively different kind of warfare, one in which Allied advantages in production, research, and coordination had reached critical mass. The symbolic element that perhaps best represents this transformation is the sound of Allied aircraft engines, a noise that recurred in German patrol logs throughout May 1943 with increasing frequency and dread. In the early war years, U-boats had operated in mid-Atlantic spaces where aircraft seldom ventured, and the sound of engines overhead was rare enough to be notable but not threatening. By May 1943, that sound had become constant, the background noise of Atlantic operations.
It represented not just the presence of individual patrol aircraft, but the closure of the Atlantic Gap, the extension of Allied air power across the entire convoy route, and the industrial capacity required to build, maintain, and operate hundreds of long-range aircraft in sustained maritime patrol operations.
The engine noise arrived without warning because the radar that guided those aircraft operated on wavelengths German equipment could not detect. It came from distances that seemed impossible, aircraft vectored to submarine positions through intelligence intercepts and radio direction finding. It persisted across weather conditions that had once provided concealment because centimetric radar could penetrate fog and darkness. And it multiplied across the month until U-boat commanders reported hearing engines almost continuously, a droning presence overhead that forced boats to remain submerged, unable to charge batteries, unable to reposition, slowly losing operational capability under the pressure of constant surveillance. For the men in those submarines, the week in May when U-boats became easy targets was experienced not as a single catastrophic event, but as a series of small failures of systems they had trusted. The radar warning receiver that stayed silent while an aircraft approached, the periscope observation that revealed an empty horizon moments before depth charges exploded from a destroyer that had tracked them with sonar. The radio signal sent to headquarters that brought not reinforcements, but a warning that Allied direction-finding equipment had plotted their position and support groups were converging. Each incident represented a tactical environment that had become transparent to their enemies and opaque to themselves. The transformation extended beyond technology to the psychological and institutional levels. U-boat crews had operated with a certain confidence in their own capability, a belief reinforced by 3 years of successful operations that they were the elite arm of the German Navy, technically proficient and tactically superior to the merchant sailors and escort crews they faced. That confidence eroded in May 1943 as crews discovered that technical proficiency no longer guaranteed survival, that tactical skill could not compensate for systemic Allied advantages in detection and coordination, and that the naval war had evolved into a form of combat where individual excellence mattered less than industrial and organizational capacity. The institutional response was necessarily limited by Germany's strategic position. Dönitz could withdraw U-boats from the North Atlantic convoy routes, but he could not withdraw from the Atlantic campaign itself without conceding strategic defeat. The submarines remained Germany's primary method for interdicting Allied supply lines, and no alternative existed. So the U-boats would return to the Atlantic later in 1943, equipped with improved radar warning devices and heavier anti-aircraft armament, operating under modified tactics designed to reduce vulnerability to air attack. But the fundamental equation would not change. Allied production would continue to outpace German construction. Allied technology would continue to evolve faster than German countermeasures, and Allied coordination would continue to improve through institutional learning and operational experience. Some boats did survive the May 1943 battles and returned to base with their crews intact. Their patrol reports describe operations conducted under constant threat, boats that spent most of their patrol time submerged to avoid aircraft, that aborted attacks when radar warning receivers detected search emissions, that returned to base without firing torpedoes because tactical opportunities never materialized. These reports document the transition from offensive to defensive operations, from hunter to hunted, from a technological and tactical edge to a struggle for survival against opponents who seemed to possess unlimited resources and systematic advantages in detection and coordination. The longer-term consequences of May 1943 extended beyond the tactical defeat in the North Atlantic. The withdrawal of U-boats from convoy routes allowed Allied shipping to deliver supplies to Britain without prohibitive losses, enabling the buildup of forces required for the invasion of Europe.
The loss of experienced U-boat crews created a training and morale problem that would plague German submarine operations for the remainder of the war. The demonstration of Allied technological and industrial capability reinforced the strategic reality that Germany faced opponents who could outproduce and out-innovate its own war economy across multiple domains simultaneously. For the Allied naval forces, May 1943 marked the validation of a systematic approach to anti-submarine warfare that integrated technology, intelligence, training, and industrial production into an effective operational system. The success was not the result of any single innovation, but of the coordinated development and deployment of multiple capabilities over years of sustained effort. Centimetric radar mattered because it was installed on sufficient numbers of aircraft and escort vessels. Long-range patrol aircraft mattered because they operated from bases positioned to cover convoy routes. Intelligence intercepts mattered because the information they provided could be acted upon by support groups positioned to respond. Each element reinforced the others, creating a system where the whole exceeded the sum of its parts. The human dimension of this transformation is preserved in the patrol logs and war diaries that document the May 1943 operations. German submariners described the psychological strain of operating under constant surveillance, the exhaustion of remaining submerged for extended periods, the frustration of being unable to attack targets they could detect, and the fear that came with the knowledge that Allied forces seemed to know their positions before they could position for attack. Allied escort crews described the satisfaction of successful attacks after years of watching merchant ships sink without being able to prevent it, but also the recognition that anti-submarine warfare remained dangerous work, requiring sustained attention and technical competence. What happened in May 1943 was not the end of the U-boat war. German submarines would continue to operate in the Atlantic and other theaters until the end of the war in Europe. New submarine designs would be developed, some incorporating technological innovations that briefly restored tactical parity. Individual boats would achieve successful patrols, sinking Allied ships and returning to base with their crews intact. But the strategic balance established in May 1943 would not shift again. The Allies had demonstrated that they could protect convoy routes, that they could hunt and destroy submarines faster than Germany could build them, and that they possessed the industrial and technological capacity to sustain these operations indefinitely. The sound of Allied aircraft engines continued to echo across the Atlantic for the remainder of the war, a constant presence overhead that forced U-boats to operate submerged, that limited their tactical options, and that represented the reach of an industrial system capable of projecting power across thousands of miles of ocean. That sound was not the noise of a single aircraft or a single patrol, but the accumulated effect of hundreds of aircraft, tens of thousands of trained aircrew, millions of hours of flight time, and the industrial capacity required to sustain those operations year after year. It was the sound of a democracy mobilized for war, of an economy that could produce weapons and equipment at scales totalitarian states could not match, and a system that could learn, adapt, and improve faster than its opponents could respond. In the end, the week in May 1943, when German U-boats became easy targets, was not about superior courage or inferior skill. The men in those submarines were professionals doing difficult and dangerous work with the equipment and training their nation could provide. The men in the escort vessels and patrol aircraft were equally professional, equally committed, and equally human. What differed was the system behind them, the industrial and technological capacity that each side could bring to bear, and the ability of one side to coordinate and integrate multiple capabilities into an effective whole. The U-boats became easy targets not because German submariners failed, but because Allied industrial democracies succeeded in creating and deploying a system of warfare that could detect, track, and destroy submarines with methodical efficiency. The fog still rolled across the North Atlantic in late May 1943, as it always had. The water remained cold and indifferent. But the submarines that had moved through those waters like shadows had become visible, their positions known, their movements predicted, their fates increasingly certain. The transformation required years of effort, billions of dollars of investment, and the coordinated work of thousands of people across multiple nations and institutions. But in the second week of May 1943, that effort reached fruition, and the ocean that had once concealed German submarines became transparent to the forces hunting them. What followed was not triumph, but the slow, methodic prosecution of a campaign already decided, the inevitable conclusion of a contest between industrial systems where one side possessed advantages the other could not overcome.